Good morning, class. Today is Tuesday, November 20th. And what we are going to do today is transition. We're going to try to transition from Aristotle to Descartes. Remember, please stay up to date on the reading schedule on Canvas. You'll see that this week we are beginning our section on Descartes. But what I want to do first, before we do anything else today, what I want to do today is actually to start out with a video. So please watch this. This is a video on the Greek gods. Video on the Greek gods.
The world began with several primordial beings. First came chaos, then Gaia, earth, and finally Eros, love. From Gaia there came Uranus, heaven, who both created the Titans. Uranus disliked his children and locked them deep within the earth. Gaia, sick of having her children imprisoned, made a great sickle that she gave to her son Cronus. Cronus hid until Uranus came to lie with his mother, then leapt out and sliced off his father's genitals, which fell into the sea. Cronus proceeded to release his fellow Titans from prison, and so the Age of the Titans began. Cronus married the Titan Rhea, who gave birth to most of the major gods. Cronus, scared by a prophecy that his children would take his power, imprisoned them as soon as they were born, swallowing them whole. Rhea pleaded to Gaia for help, who, taking pity, hid Zeus after he was born on Mount Ida in Crete. When Cronus came to eat his son, Rhea fed him a stone instead, tricking the Titan. Gaia raised Zeus until he was strong enough to take on his father. The two fought, and upon defeat, Cronus was forced to release Zeus's siblings, starting the war between the gods and the Titans. The war lasted 12 years until Zeus freed the Cyclopses and the 100-headed giants whom Cronus had imprisoned. The Cyclopses gifted Zeus his famous thunderbolt, Poseidon his trident, and Hades a hat of darkness, tipping the balance of battle. The Titans, defeated, were thrown into Tartarus, a prison deep within the underworld, and so started the reign of the gods. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades decided to share power, drawing lots to decide what they would rule over. Zeus got the sky, Poseidon the seas, and Hades the dead. Zeus, king of the gods, ruled from his throne on Mount Olympus, home of the immortals, often using his symbols of the thunderbolt and eagle to warn or encourage mortals. Zeus was responsible for all weather changes, from lightning to snow, depending on his mood. He was also protector of the home and strangers, meaning being a bad host could land you in deep trouble. Zeus married his sister Hera, who birthed the gods Ares and Hephaestus. Zeus was also infamous for his many affairs with other goddesses, from which Athena, Hermes, Apollo, Artemis, and Persephone came. He also engaged in many affairs with mortal women, where he created god Dionysus, and many heroes like Perseus and Hercules, most of whom experienced the wrath of a jealous Hera. Poseidon, one of the most powerful gods, ruled the sea, created earthquakes, and was the god of horses, much prized in ancient society. He had a palace on Mount Olympus, but an even more magnificent one under the sea, where he spent most of his time. Sailors would have to pray to Poseidon and offer sufficient sacrifice, otherwise risk a painful death at sea. It was very unwise to cross Poseidon, as he held a grudge and could deal out very harsh punishments. In the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, King Minos rules over the island Crete. Every year he sacrificed his best bull to Poseidon. One year he withheld his favorite bull, a huge white animal. Poseidon noticed, but instead of punishing Minos directly, he decided to target his wife. He made her fall in love with the bull, which eventually led to the birth of the half-man, half-bull creature called the Minotaur. Hades, the oldest of the brothers, ruled over the underworld where the spirits of the dead resided. He shared his throne with his wife, Persephone, and the two were considered to be gods of fertility. The underworld had several guardians and trials, making it difficult for the dead and near impossible for the living to enter. The gates lay past the deadly river Styx. The only way to enter was to get passage from the ferryman, Charon. Charon required payment, and this is the reason why Greek burials included placing coins on the eyes of the deceased. If the soul could not afford to enter, then they were fated to wait on the shores of the Styx forever. Past Charon lay Cerberus, the fabled three-headed dog who guards the gates of the underworld. Ultimately, the soul will reach the three judges of the underworld who decide where it should go. They can choose Elysium, the fields of Asphodel, or Tartarus. Elysium is akin to heaven, a peaceful place where the souls of heroes, demigods, and especially good mortals reside. The Asphodel Meadows is the place for ordinary folk who did not achieve anything notable in life, good or evil. Tartarus is very similar to Hell and contains not only the Titans, but also criminals who upset the gods, who are tortured for eternity. Hera, sister and wife of Zeus and queen of the gods, was the protector of marriage and women. She was deeply respected in Greek society. She was one of the most vengeful and spiteful gods, punishing women who lay with her husband and any subsequent children. When Leto was pregnant with Apollo and Artemis, Hera stopped her giving birth. She kept Io, another of Zeus's mistresses, as a Hephaestion, and had her guarded by the hundred-eyed monster Argos. A famous tale of her jealous vengeance is the story of Hercules. Hercules was an illegitimate child of Zeus. Hera sent serpents to kill the future hero when he was just a child, but the demigod crushed creatures with his bare hands. She later drove him to madness, making him kill his wife and children, the event that sent him on his 12 labors. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, the child of Zeus and Metis, was not born in a conventional way. Zeus received an omen that their children would take the throne from him, and so swallowed Metis while she was pregnant. After this, Zeus began to get a terrible headache. He asked a fellow immortal, thought to be Hephaestus, to split his head open with an axe. Athena was then born from his forehead, jumping out in full battle gear while letting out a war cry. Athena had an affinity for heroics, coming to the aid of heroes like Perseus and Hercules. Her favorite was Odysseus, who she worked hard to keep safe so he could return to his homeland. Athena was highly revered in Athens, which was named after her. She competed with Poseidon for the city, both of whom attempted to give it the best gift. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, making a stream of water rise up. Athena kicked the earth and caused the first olive tree to emerge. The gods deemed Athena victorious, and the city took her name. Athena was also one of the sacred virgin goddesses, and so in her honor, the temple built on the Acropolis in Athens was named the Parthenon, which comes from Parthenos, meaning the virgin. Ares was the bloodthirsty and cruel god of war. Neither god nor mortal particularly liked Ares. The warfare he represents is not honorable nor heroic, but rather the primal rage and bloodshed of the battlefield. Ares had a relationship with the goddess Aphrodite, who was married to the god Hephaestus. The two would sleep together whenever her husband was away. When Hephaestus found out, he made an invisible net and hung it over his bed, and told his wife he was going away. He hid, and as soon as Ares and Aphrodite got into bed together, they were trapped in the net and unable to move. Hephaestus called upon all the gods, inviting them to see the two naked immortals trapped in the net. Laughter burst out everywhere, and it was only due to the intervention of Poseidon that they were released. Aphrodite was the goddess of beauty and love, responsible for sexual attraction in both mortal and immortal alike, often using her powers for her own amusement. Accounts of her birth vary, with her either being born from the genitals of Uranus or as another illegitimate child of Zeus. Aphrodite had a pivotal role in the Trojan War when Prince Paris of Troy was tasked with giving an apple to the fairest goddess, Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite, each promising him something different in return. Paris chose Aphrodite, who promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. Helen was married to the king of Sparta, Menelaus. Aphrodite put Helen under a spell when Paris came to visit Sparta, making her run away with him. King Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon raised a massive army to go take Helen back from Troy, and so started the Trojan War. Goddess of the hunt and twin sister of Apollo, Artemis was a deadly archer and an important member of Olympus. She watched over hunters as well as their prey, ensuring the wilderness was kept in check. Artemis is also prized for her virginity and guarded it jealously. The hunter Actaeon once stumbled upon her naked as she was bathing. Artemis proceeded to change the man into a deer and set his 50 hunting dogs upon him, giving him a painful death for his mistake. Twin brother of Artemis, Apollo was a god of many things. He was a god of archery, but also of light and music, seen with a lyre as much as a bow. Apollo is closely linked with prophecy. He was born on Delos and honored the island by setting up an oracle there. He later traveled to Mount Parnassus and slew the great snake Pytho. He created a temple where he had achieved the feat, marking the foundations for where the famous oracle of Delphi would reside. Hermes, the messenger god and patron of thieves. Known as a trickster amongst the gods, he often pulled pranks and stole from his fellow divinities. When he came of age, he assumed the role of messenger, taking a golden rod with him as a mark of his authority. He is often seen with a winged helmet and sandals, which he used to fly around and deliver messages. Demeter, the goddess of farming and watcher of the harvest. The one thing she prized more than anything else was her daughter, Persephone. It happened that Hades was also interested in Persephone, as he had fallen in love with her. One day, while the girl was picking flowers, he opened up the ground and dragged her down to the underworld. Demeter was distraught when she found out and searched for her daughter for 9 days and nights until the sun god Helios revealed her captor's identity. Demeter locked herself indoors for an entire year, refusing to come out until Persephone was returned. Without the goddess of farming, the world went into famine. In order to save the world, Zeus ordered Hades to release Persephone. Hades had fed the girl the food of the dead, a pomegranate, meaning that she was bound to him. After much discussion, Zeus decided that Hades could have Persephone for 3 months of the year, and Demeter could have her for the other 9 months. This explains why the winter months are cold and the plants die, as Demeter waits for her daughter to return. God of smithing, Hephaestus had a difficult start to life. He was born lame, and so his mother Hera decided to throw him off Olympus into the sea to drown. He later returned to the home of the gods and was given Aphrodite as a wife by Hera to reconcile with him. He was a great inventor and fashioned many of the palaces on Olympus. He also fashioned the equipment of many heroes, such as Achilles, whom he created armor and a magnificent shield for. God of wine and parties, Dionysus was perhaps the most fun of the Olympians. Frenzied women called Maenads and half-goat men called satyrs followed him. He had a huge cult following in Greece, where his followers would participate in mass drinking and the orgies his mythological companions were so well known for. The Greek gods represent humanity at its best and worst. From the violent and destructive Ares to the beautiful and seductive Aphrodite, Greek mythology demonstrates the epic power struggle between parents and children in an endless quest to gain control over the world. Tales passed down from each generation, showing them to be some of the most influential deities in human history that continue to have a significant impact to this day.
Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and for exclusive rewards, check out our Patreon page.
Okay, y'all, very good. Thank you for watching that video with me. Let me see if I can make my slides work. So what I want to do now is talk about that video real quickly. Why did I show that video to you guys? Here's why. It's because we have been talking a lot in this class about God. And like I said, last class on Thursday, it's not because this is a Sunday school class. It's not because this is a religion or a theology class. It's not because I expect you to agree with me and to be a theist or a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or anything like that. No. The reason we talk about God in this class is because I'm convinced that if you want to understand the history of philosophy in the West, you need to understand at least a little bit about how various people throughout history, various thinkers, beginning with the ancient world, how they have thought about God. In other words, God as a philosophical theme is a huge part of this class. Now, in the last class, I showed a video from an AMC series called The Preacher, and you might remember that scene that I showed. It was kind of like the Wizard of Oz in the sense that there's this mysterious divine entity or being that turns out to be kind of a hoax, kind of a trick, kind of an imposter. And the way that deity was portrayed in that clip that I showed last time was in the form of an old man with a beard. And at one point, as the people are watching this old man with the beard on some sort of video screen in some sort of a church, at one point he begins to pick his nose. And what you begin to realize is that this old man sitting on the chair who picks his nose and has a long beard and seems kind of anxious and uptight anyway, it turns out that he's not God. It turns out that he's sort of an imposter God, and he's just sort of been pretending to be God, even though a lot of people have gone along with it. Now, in this class, beginning with Parmenides, we have traced the ways that certain people have issued forth critiques of gods, critiques of the deity. We looked at Parmenides, who says that God, who puts forth a notion of being that doesn't look like an old man with a beard. Parmenides' notion of being is simple. It has to be that which does not change, that which does not consist of parts and wholes, that which is not spatially extended, et cetera, et cetera. We also looked at Plato in the Euthyphro and the Apology, and he gets into trouble for what? For denying the gods of the city. Gods like Zeus and all the other Greek gods that we just saw in that video. Then you fast forward to Aristotle, and Aristotle looks at Parmenides and says, Parmenides, that thing you thought you were describing with being, it turns out you were talking about God. And so Aristotle comes along and he adopts everything that Parmenides said about being, all of those negations, and he applies those to his God. And he calls his God theos, and also thought thinking itself, and also the prime or unmoved mover. But the point is that Aristotle's God is nothing like that old man in the sky, that old man with a beard. Now, why did I show that video? I showed that video kind of to reference the Greek gods, the Homeric gods, the pantheon of gods. I think that video discussed both what's called the Titan pantheon and the the Athenian pantheon. And the bottom line is that, look, the Greek gods and the stories that Homer and Hesiod and others tell, they're amazing stories. Like, I'm not trying to say that all of that stuff is stupid or anything like that. And by the way, Plato doesn't say that they're stupid. He does offer a critique of it, but then he also, in certain ways, appeals back to it. In other words, even though Plato wants to uphold the primacy of logos, he also has a real place for mythos in his work, in his thought. And so the point isn't that those stories are simply stupid, but the point is that the gods that are portrayed in those stories aren't good enough. They're not sufficient. They need to be critiqued. I mean, even in that video, the narrator said that the Greek gods represent humanity at its best and its worst. So in other words, God is kind of like a projection of humanity in its best and its worst. Well, someone like Plato or Parmenides or Aristotle comes along and says, that's not good enough. If God is real, God has to be completely different from nature, the realm of becoming, fuchsious, and God must be much closer to something like Parmenidean being. And we see that in Plato and we see that in Aristotle. But I wanted to show that video just to remind us of the sort of gods that are being critiqued throughout the course of this class. And then also when we get to Nietzsche in a few weeks, we're going to need to think about those Greek gods again. Okay, so that's why I wanted to show you that video. It's connected to the video from the series Preacher that we talked about last class. Now, y'all, speaking of the last class, my PowerPoint presentation did something weird in that last class. And so I just wanted quickly to see if I could review the second and third of the 3 points that I tried to give in last class. Now, and I'm not going to pull up the picture this time because I'm worried that somehow my PowerPoint presentation will get stuck like it did last time. But I just want to review really quickly Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum, which is a super big deal. We've talked about it over and over and throughout the course of the class. And on one end of the metaphysical spectrum, you have what? Prime matter. All the way over to the other end of Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum, you have something called pure form. And there's lots of associations that we can make on both ends of the spectrum, both with prime matter and with pure form. And that's what that pic is about, that JPEG that you have on Canvas. But remember that there are things in the middle. There are things in the middle between prime matter on the one hand and pure form on the other. In fact, everything in the world is in between those two extremes. And most everything in the world that's in between those two extremes can be thought of as composite unities of form and matter, composite unities of form and matter. The objects of the world, the things that we see in the world, like chairs and oak trees and frogs, those things for Aristotle are composite unities of form and matter. And they're all in between the two extremes of prime matter or pure form, right? But there were a couple of different classes of things in particular that are important, that I think that it's worthwhile to pause and discuss. And the first of those two classes of things is right next to prime matter, right? It's almost to prime matter, meaning that it has a very low degree of form. It's almost pure matter. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the four elements of earth, wind, fire, and water. I drew a dirt cloud on the picture to represent this. And what's the point about the dirt cloud? What's the point about those four elements of earth, wind, fire, and water? Well, the point about them is that they have a minimal level of form. They're as close to prime matter as you can possibly get, while still having a minimal level of form such that human beings can recognize them. Okay. And when we talked about those four elements of earth, wind, fire, and water, which come from a pre-Socratic thinker named Empedocles, but even before him, he's picking them up from the Milesians / physicalists / naturalists, people like Thales, who said that all is water, right? So first you have Thales and others who say that the basic principle of all reality is one particular element. Then Empedocles comes along and says, oh, no, that can't be right. There's not one element, there's four. And that's kind of like our periodic table of elements, right? I think that we have 131 elements that we say all material reality is composed of. Well, that's exactly what Empedocles was doing. It's just that he didn't have 131 elements. He only had four. And those four elements proved to be determinative all throughout the pre-modern world. Plato affirms that. He follows Empedocles. Aristotle follows Empedocles in affirming the four elements. But the point about them is that they're very close to prime matter. They have as little form in them as a thing can possibly have without descending into the chaos of prime matter. Okay, so that's sort of on one extreme of the spectrum. These four elements and the dirt clod are almost prime matter, but go to the other extreme, the other end of the spectrum, and you have another special class of things that are right next to pure form. And what are those things? Those things are mathematical shapes, aka numbers or mathematical entities. The ancients like Plato and Pythagoras were sort of obsessed with number, but I find that for the modern mind, for people like you and me, it's helpful to think in terms of geometric shapes like triangles, circles, and squares. Okay, and what is the point about those geometric squares, which are almost butting right up against pure form? The point about them is that uh, their constitution of form and matter is unusual. And to put it very, very simply, to oversimplify a little bit, what you could say is that they are top heavy with form. Okay, if the four elements are top heavy with matter, then the numbers, aka the geometrical shapes, are top heavy with form. Now, what does that mean? Now, to say more about that, we need to do a review of this little schema, which I call Aristotle's hierarchy of entities. And the point of this little schema is to show you that numbers are special. Geometric shapes are special. If you think about all the things that exist in the world, there is something special about numbers. And if you can grasp this truth, which I admit is not an easy thing to grasp, but if you can grasp this truth, you can see how geometric shapes like triangles are top heavy with form. Okay, but in order to talk about this, y'all, we do need to appeal to our proverbial philosophical dictionary, which is actually an airtight philosophical dictionary, which means that you can look up anything in the world in this philosophically airtight dictionary and find an exhaustive definition. So you can look up frog and find an exhaustive definition of frog. And y'all, I am going to pull something up really, really quick. Please bear with me, and I'm very grateful. I might be having an internet issue again. All right, here we go. All right. Oh, okay. So in the philosophical airtight dictionary, you can look up any term and you can find a philosophically airtight definition of that thing, right? So for example, you could look up coin, you could look up iPhone, you could look up frog, or you could look up Amarillidae. Amarillidae. Amarillidoideae, otherwise known as a snowflower, I think. And this is that is the genus and species classification of a kind of flowering plant. And you could look that up in the philosophically airtight dictionary, and it is going to tell you everything possible about that organism. Okay, it's going to talk about the genus and the species. It's going to talk about the the material out of which it's made, like carbon molecules and things like that. It's going to talk about the reproductive capabilities of that organism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the point is, you can look stuff up and find a philosophically airtight or exhaustive definition of a thing. Now, y'all look with me at the screen. You can see that there's 3 different levels of entities in the world, okay? At the bottom, you have what you might call natural entities, like frogs and giraffes. Right above that, you have what you might call natural entities, like numbers and shapes. And then at the top level, you have what you might call theological entities or metaphysical entities, like angels and spirits. Now, I know that some of you don't believe in angels and spirits, and that's okay. Let's just talk about them as if they exist. And I think that you're going to see something really interesting in this thought experiment, which comes to us from Aristotle and Boethius and Thomas Aquinas, okay? Now, if you start at the bottom and think about natural entities like frogs, giraffes, acorns, and the Amarilla doideae, and if you ask the question, starting with the right-hand column, if you ask the question, is that thing separable from matter in reality? What does that mean? That means basically, have you ever seen a frog that was immaterial? And the answer is no, okay? Which means that a frog or a giraffe or any other natural entity is always composed of matter. Okay, now y'all, that might seem like a really mundane point, but as we continue, I think that you'll see that it's kind of important. Every single frog that has ever been observed is composed of matter. And that's why we say that a frog is not separable from matter, okay? Now look at the next column to the left, the column in the middle. It says separable in thought. What does that mean? That means we've already established that every single frog that exists in reality is a frog that is composed of matter, and therefore you have to say that frogs are not separable from matter in reality. Well, this other column that says separable in thought question mark is asking the question, when you look up the definition of frog in the philosophically airtight dictionary, will it necessarily talk about matter? In other words, is it possible to exhaustively define a frog or a giraffe or an Amarilla doideae, is it possible exhaustively to define those things without talking about matter? And the answer is no. If you look up any of those items in the philosophically airtight dictionary, you're going to find that it will talk about matter. If you look up frog, it's going to talk about matter. It's going to talk about bones and sinew and the kind of tissue that it is that a frog has, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So when it comes to these natural entities like frogs and giraffes, we see that they are not separable in reality, and they are also not separable in thought. They are not separable in definition. They're not separable from matter in the philosophically airtight dictionary, okay? So that's the case for natural entities like frogs, giraffes, plants, and the Amarilla doideae, okay? Now, what if we go up one level and talk about geometrical shapes like triangles and circles? Start at the right. Are geometric shapes separable from matter in reality? Translation, have you ever seen a triangle or a circle or a square that was not composed of matter? And the answer is no, which is why there's an N in that quadrant, in that square, okay? The answer is no. Why is the answer no? The answer is no because every single square or circle or geometric shape that you've ever seen is composed of matter, maybe wood, maybe brass, maybe chalk on a chalkboard, maybe pixels on a computer screen. But those are all material composition, and every single geometric shape that anyone has ever seen. I'm looking at one right now that's made out of cloth and thread. Every single geometric shape that anyone has ever seen is composed of matter. And therefore we say that those shapes are not separable from matter in reality, which is why there's an N in that square, in that cell, okay? Go to the left. Are geometric shapes separable from thought in reality? In other words, are they separable from matter? I should have said, are they separable from matter in our philosophically airtight dictionary? Are they separable from matter in terms of definition? And the answer, y'all, is yes. In other words, if you look up the definition of triangle or circle in the philosophically airtight dictionary, what you're going to find is that it is not going to say anything about matter. It's not going to say that essential to the reality or the essence of a circle is that it's made out of wood. No, it's not going to say that it is essential to understand that circles are made out of brass. No. Why is that? It is because geometric shapes are separable from reality and thought. Now, this could get very complicated, and so we have to keep it as simple as possible. But the basic idea is that no material composition is essential to a geometric shape. Rather, geometric shapes are able to be thought. They are able to be abstractly thought. They are also able to be expressed in terms of mere formula, right? You can't express a frog with an algebraic formula, but you can express a circle in that way, okay? You can think it, you can imagine it in a way that is not composed of any kind of matter like earth, wind, fire, or water. And you can also derive a formula that is expressive of it, okay? And all of that indicates that numbers and shapes are separable from thought in reality. And y'all, whenever we talk about how Plato is sort of obsessed with numbers and Pythagoras is obsessed with numbers, this gets to why that is, or at least it begins to get at something that is very special about the notion and the nature of number and mathematical entities, okay? Now, the key point here is that numbers and shapes are separable from matter in thought. Matter is not essentially constitutive of number. Now, y'all, here's the upshot of this thought experiment. If that's the case for number, then why should we balk at saying that that is also the case for spiritual entities like angels, spirits, or God? In other words, a lot of people make the case, a lot of people want to say there's no way that God exists because he's not composed of matter. There's no way that God exists because God or she has never been observed empirically. Okay. Numbers are similar to that. Shapes are similar to that. So shapes are not essentially composed of material reality. And so if you're going to deny the existence of God, it seems like there might be reasons to deny the existence of number as well, okay? number slash geometric shape. That's kind of like the upshot of this little schema. But look with me at that top level, the level of metaphysical or spiritual or theological entities like angels, spirits, or indeed God. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but that's okay. Are they separable in reality? The answer is yes. You've never seen an angel or a spirit that is composed of material reality. Now, there is a thing in the Bible called theophanies. We're not going to talk about that right now. A theophany is whenever an angel appears to human beings in the form of of something that the eye can see. We're not going to talk about that right now. For now, we're just going to say that angels and spirits and divine entities are separable from reality are separable from matter in reality. And they're also separable in thought, because if you look up the definition of angel in the philosophically airtight dictionary, you're not going to read anything about matter in the definition of that being. And if we were to say the same thing about God, although it's not possible to have an airtight definition of God, but forgetting about that for a moment, if we were to look up the definition of God in the philosophically airtight dictionary, it would definitely not say anything about matter. Okay, y'all, that's Aristotle's hierarchy of entities. And it has to do with the metaphysical spectrum because it has to do with number slash shape. It also has to do with the way that Aristotle talks about God. Okay, and it also, thirdly and finally, it gets at one of the key themes of this class, namely matter. This class is largely a meditation on the way that people throughout history have thought about matter and the way that people throughout history have thought about God. Okay. And I wanted to just review that from last time because I had some technical difficulties. And I want to make two last points about Aristotle's God. And these are kind of, one of them is review. The first one is review. The second, I may have forgotten to talk about in this class so far, but I finally remembered. Thanks be to God. First, remember that Aristotle has three different names for God. One is theos, which is simply the Greek word God. Secondly, though, Aristotle refers to as God, and this is all in the metaphysics. This is all in the metaphysics. These last 2 points about Aristotle, before we launch into Descartes, both pertain to Aristotle's metaphysics. And in the metaphysics, he has three names for God: Theos, the unmoved mover slash prime mover, and then thirdly, thought thinking itself. Thought thinking itself. And the point that we've talked about in the past, the point is that packed into Aristotle's conception of God is this notion of reflexivity. God is neither simply a subject nor simply an object. God somehow is both. And so there's a lot of reasons why I think this is interesting. One reason, though, is that it means that Aristotle's God is a little bit different from Parmenidean being, because Aristotle's God is not simply static. Parmenidean being is apparently static. Parmenides doesn't say anything about being thinking. In other words, Parmenides does not say that being thinks, but Aristotle does say that God thinks, and what's more, God thinks about God. Thought thinks about itself. Aristotle's God is thought thinking itself, and in this God there is a certain reflexivity. We're going to talk more about reflexivity as we get into Descartes. let's go to the second last point. This is the very, very last point that I want to make about Aristotle before we sort of transition to Descartes. And that is that when Aristotle wrote this book called the Metaphysics, he did not call this work the Metaphysics. We've talked about this before. We've talked about the specific way that this book got its title. There's a legend from ancient philosophy that literally says that it was after the physics on a bookshelf. We talked about that. We also just talked about how meta can mean beyond. So you could see that work as treating a subject matter that is beyond physics. We talked about all that. But there's two other ways that Aristotle himself refers to that work or refers to that subject matter that work treats. First, he calls it theologia, theology. He calls this work theologia. And then he also calls it first philosophy. Now, y'all, I think that next class, I am going to come back to that notion of first philosophy. And I'm also going to talk about one other transitional theme from Aristotle to Descartes. But for now, I just wanted to point out that Aristotle calls the metaphysics theologia, and he also calls it first philosophy. Okay? We watched the video on the Greek gods. Y'all, what I want to do for the last 15 or 20 minutes of this class is begin to introduce Descartes. Before I do that, though, even before I do that, I need to make one more transitional point. Between Aristotle and Descartes, so I lied earlier, maybe, or actually not really. This is connected to the notion of first philosophy. Remember, Aristotle calls this work or the subject matter that it treats first philosophy. Now, we will say more about what first philosophy means next class. It's very important. It's kind of like the foundation of the system of sciences, and we will talk more about that. But what I want to say to you is this. What is the title of the book by Descartes that we're reading? What is the title of that book? The title of that book is Meditations on what? Meditations on First Philosophy. Wow, that's really interesting. Whatever it is that Descartes thinks he's doing in the meditations in his project, it has something to do with what he calls first philosophy, which means that it has something to do with what Aristotle is doing in this book. Now that is interesting. Yeah, I'm going to talk more about this notion of first philosophy in the next class. But for now, I just want you to know that both Aristotle and Descartes are interested in this thing called first philosophy, okay? And y'all, that is true despite the fact that Descartes is writing 2,000 years after Aristotle is writing. So for all of the changes that have happened between Aristotle writing, 300 years before Christ, all the way up to Descartes writing 1600 and a half years, 16 and a half centuries after Christ, for all of the things that have changed between those two points in time. And there are so many, and we're going to talk about them a little bit next class. But in spite of all of the things that have changed, they are both talking about first philosophy. What is first philosophy? We're going to get to that next class, okay? For now, I want to end this class, which is our initial transition from Aristotle to Descartes, I want to begin with three big themes. There are three big themes in Descartes that I want to emphasize. One of them is systematic doubt. Y'all, we live in a world in which people in the West are default skeptics. I don't know if you've ever seen a bumper sticker. There was a bumper sticker that was popular maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And the bumper sticker says this: question authority. Have you ever seen that bumper sticker, question authority? I lived in Austin for several years before moving to Tyler, and there were a lot of cars in Austin with that bumper sticker, question authority. What's the point about that? The point is that you and I live in a world in which most people just assume that we ought to be skeptics, that we ought to doubt things. We can't just accept things on the basis of faith. We can't just accept things at face value. That would be naive. That would be naive. And in our world, it's important not to be naive. Well, the simple point that I want to make right now is that the reason we feel that way and the reason that we have those assumptions can be traced directly back to Descartes. Descartes is the first person in the history of the West to make this a formal principle of his thinking. He wants to say, and we're going to talk about this more, he wants to say that unless you can achieve certainty, you ought not to accept the truth of the church. You ought not to accept the truth of the Bible. You ought not to accept the truth of theology. You ought not to accept the truth of traditional philosophy. You have to prove it. And we're going to talk about how he thinks you prove it as we continue. Okay. And it's going to have something to do with clear and distinct ideas. Clear and distinct ideas. Okay. And that's the first big theme that we want to highlight as we begin to transition to Descartes, this notion of systematic doubt. Y'all, here's a second big theme in Descartes, which again has created the modern world that we live in to a very large extent. And I call it the journey inward. If you think about Aristotle, we've talked about Aristotle. We talked about Aristotle's tripartite soul. You've got rational soul at the top, sensate soul in the middle, and the vegetative soul at the bottom. But think about that middle portion of the soul that is characteristic of all animals. The sensate soul. What's the point there? The point there is that sense perception for Aristotle is a really big deal. Aristotle says that everything we know by way of our senses: seeing, hearing, touching, etc. See, for Aristotle, we know things by looking outside of us. We know things by interacting with the external world by way of our sense perception, okay? Sense perception is very, very important for Aristotle and for the Aristotelian tradition. But for Descartes, it's a little bit different. In fact, Descartes is more of a Platonist in this way. We're going to talk about that more and more. We're going to talk about how Descartes is actually more of a Platonist. But this is one of the ways in which that's true. For Descartes, we don't attain knowledge or scientia. Remember, we've been talking about scientia, which is the highest form of the logos for the Western philosophical tradition. We've been talking about scientia, which is also just knowledge. Remember, Daedalus, the character in Plato's dialogues, whose figures move around, and Socrates wants to say knowledge is tied down, it's secured, it has solid reasons that are underpinning it, right? That's scientia, or knowledge. And for Aristotle, we achieve that kind of knowledge in part by looking outside of us. But for Descartes, no, you cannot trust your sense perception. You need to be doubtful or skeptical of it. And so what you do is you engage in a journey inward. You begin with stuff that is outside of you, and then you realize, oh my gosh, I can't really trust that. I think that I see a chair over there. I think that I see a tree outside my office window, but I can't be certain of those things. So I have to doubt them. I have to assume that they don't exist, and I have to begin to move inward. As I move inward to things like my feelings, my memory, all the way in to what he calls mind, which is the rock bottom of interiority, as he moves from the things of the external world inward into himself, all the way to his mind. He thinks that he and we can begin to attain certainty. But the point is that Descartes is involved in a journey inward. Inward into what? Into a cave? No, into himself, a journey into himself. Okay. And y'all, that leads me to my third big point today. What I'm doing is just throwing out big major themes in Descartes that we are going to come back to over and over again for the next 2 or 3 weeks. And the last one is called what I call Ghost in the Machine. Now, I am someone who has had a real love of beer throughout my life. And in fact, I'm someone who's brewed lots of beer at home. And there's one particular kind of beer that is really good, called an IPA, an Indian Pale Ale. Well, my favorite Indian Pale Ale is called the Ghost in the Machine. You can Google it. I should have put a pic up, but Ghost in the Machine is the name of an IPA, an India Pale Ale. I think it's brewed somewhere in Louisiana. It's a really good beer, but that phrase "ghost in the machine" is one of the ways that people have talked about the way Descartes views the human person. Okay, so we have talked in this class about Aristotle, and we've talked about how Aristotle views the human person. We've talked, that is, about Aristotle's anthropology, right? Anthropology is not a trendy store where women can buy clothing. Anthropology is the logos of anthropos, the logos of the human person, right? And for Aristotle, what is the human person? The human person is not like it is for Aristotle. For Aristotle, the human person is a rational animal, an animal with reason, an animal with logos, an animal with language, right? But not for Descartes. Descartes does not agree with Aristotle that the human person is an animal. For Descartes, the human person is mind. In other words, for Descartes, if you look up human being in the philosophically airtight dictionary, is it going to talk about matter? Is it going to talk about bodies? No, it's not, because Descartes actually does not define the human person at all in terms of body, in terms of fingernails, in terms of carbon molecules, in terms of tissue, sinew, bones, brain. No. For Descartes, the human person, by definition, is mind. And you have to understand that mind is something that is completely immaterial for Descartes. And so that's kind of a big deal, and we're going to talk about it more. What I wanted to do in today's class is to just throw out these big themes. Y'all, there's several big themes in Descartes as we begin to transition. I'm going to add 2 more that we will come back to in the next class. Actually, yeah. First philosophy, and then finally, order of discovery. Okay. 5 big themes in Descartes: systematic doubt, the journey inward, ghost in the machine, first philosophy, and order of discovery. We will come back to these next class as we continue our entry into Rene Descartes. Y'all keep up with the reading on the reading schedule, and I will talk to you very soon. May the force be with you and also with you. Have a great day.